History is the study of the human condition. It's the same reason scientists study the stars, or the plants and animals, or other people. Because if we can understand the stars, and the atoms, and the animals, and the nature of our own being, we can understand this hostile world in which we live. And a full understanding of our world will arm us with the knowledge needed to survive and thrive within it. We use knowledge to succeed. And by studying the people of the past, we can gain the knowledge they had or the knowledge they wish they had, whilst we peer into their lives. So in short, we study history in order to study ourselves. History does not study material facts and institutions alone. Its true object of study is the human mind. It should aspire to know what this mind has believed, thought, and felt in different ages of the life of the human race. The term history is from the Greek histor, wise man, and later historia, which means to gain knowledge through inquiry, narrative, or investigation. And the simple question is, how do we go about gaining that knowledge? The answer: we study what human beings have recorded about past events. These could be accounts, diaries, memoirs, songs, tales, books, documents, and in modern times, photographs and video. This is why history is the inquiry into man, because the animals didn't record anything down, except for that one special gorilla who's a member of parliament. Prior to our own words and impact on the world, we have prehistory, which is why history is the history of humanity, his story, if you enjoy puns. And because we're trying to understand ourselves in order to survive and thrive in this world as best we can, then it's in our best interest to have an accurate record of the past so that we can gain knowledge from it. That is the ultimate purpose of history. But the question is, of course, how do we make sure we have this accurate record? How do we study the past? How do we make this inquiry? In ancient times, the Greeks took the events that happened and placed them in a chronology, an order in time. They tried to get the facts straight, but filled in the gaps with invented or imagined evidence based on what others told them. They invented entire speeches that they'd never heard. And in the case of the Romans, the Roman gods sometimes sent lightning down from the heavens to help them win battles. In medieval and early modern times, chroniclers wrote down what happened as a way of chronicling God. The world was a playground for good and evil. The word historian entered the English language around 1500. A historian was different from a chronicler because he was trying to create a narrative of the past events, not just a list of events. And it was at this time that these new historians began to see a difference between the value of different sources. Then, in the Enlightenment, rationalist historians wrote history to teach morals to the world. Historical actors were moral quantities rather than human beings. It was a way of teaching philosophy by example. The gods of old became less important, and history focused on the study of man. Then, in the Romantic era, historians viewed the past as different. It was something to be cherished and preserved. The past should be placed inside a glass bubble so that people could look back into it and see a different world compared to the present. By doing so, we could appreciate what we have now. And then came the Germans, as they do. Leopold von Ranke was a Romantic-era historian who discovered that another historian's history was wrong. He realised that history wasn't just about collecting facts, but that we have to understand the inner being of the past. He said that we have to narrate the past as it really was. We need the context of the time in order to understand the events. He also said that the past should not be judged by the standards of the present. Again, a glass ball we should look back into. In addition, the job of the historian was to correct the mistakes, the forgeries, and the falsifications that had seeped into the record. Revising history was essential to good history. Ranke also redefined the differences between the sources. Some documents were classed as primary sources, eyewitness reports of the events. These were deemed by Ranke to be the most reliable sources and therefore should be relied upon almost exclusively. Historians should abandon the libraries and go into the archives in order to immerse themselves in the context of the past. Secondary sources, like memoirs written after the event or other histories written by historians, were deemed not reliable and should be avoided. After Ranke, history became viewed as a science, and this is why you still get people saying that all historians have to do is give me the facts. So, what is the scientific method? Well, roughly speaking, you start with an observation, a skepticism of a previous analysis. Is what we know about an event true? Water boils at 100 degrees, but is this really the case? Next, we have a hypothesis, or conjecture. This is an idea we might have about the potential results of something. So, water might boil at 100 degrees in one location, but perhaps it doesn't boil at 100 degrees in another. Note, a hypothesis must be falsifiable. There must be a distinctive true or false element to it. Predictions. I predict water boils at different temperatures. Experiments. Okay, time to light the match. Analysis. Water does boil differently at different locations. Replications. This is the most important point. I must get the same results no matter how many times I try to boil the water in different locations, otherwise it's not accurate. Peer review. Hey, look everyone! When I boil water at higher altitudes, the water boils at lower temperatures. Ongoing cycle. You disagree? Okay, go ahead and test it yourself. Or you agree. Okay, let's see what else we can find out by being skeptical. And note, there are no fixed sequences of steps. The order might change, so we might do several experiments, analysis, then try a different hypothesis or observation, and do the experiments again, and so on. Yes, in the middle of your research you may end up changing your hypothesis or predictions. This is fine, this is the scientific method, and this is the method Ranke used for writing his history. Out there in the documents lay the facts, waiting to be discovered by historians, just as the stars shone out there in the heavens, waiting to be discovered by astronomers. All the historian had to do was apply the proper scientific method, eliminate his own personality from the investigation, and the facts would come to light. Of course, since all we have to do is get the facts straight, once all documents are checked and we run out of documents, the game is up. All of history will have been written. End of discussion. End of history. Except we have a couple of problems with the Rankinian idea. Take, for example, one event in history, the Battle of Stalingrad. I have all of these books specific to the Battle of Stalingrad itself, but as Ranke said, we have to put these in context, so then I have all of these on the Second World War, plus more down here, more down there, some over there, plus more on the e-books and Kindle, etc. online. So yeah, a lot of books, and these are just the secondary sources mostly. Then we have the primary sources as well, which are in several different languages: German, Russian, Italian, Romanian, Croatian, Hungarian, Ukrainian, and so on. And there's an even more stupidly colossal amount of them compared to the secondary sources. Then you have to put them all in context, and this is just one event within context. Imagine all the events going on at the same time as this event around the world, recorded. Then imagine extrapolating that across the past 5,000 years of human history. There is so much history that it is simply impossible to record it all, let alone study it. Worse, historians realise that for every question answered, 2 more would pop up. Studying historical evidence resulted in the exponential growth in the study of historical evidence. There was always another fact to check or discover, and this was recognised at the time. And historians realised that when they wrote their histories, in order to condense all the information down into 1 or 2 volumes, what they were actually doing was filtering the history. They were selecting the information that would go into the history. This in itself was unavoidable, but would lead to problems. It often seems to me as if history is like a child's box of letters with which we can spell any word we please. We have only to pick out such letters as we want, arrange them as we like, and say nothing about those which do not suit our purpose. Yes, it turns out that the Rankians weren't as objective as they preached. Even Ranke himself wrote history that wasn't as colourless as he had claimed it was, since the sources he used weren't neutral themselves. He also didn't use enough archival material, which was why he was able to write so much. The lesson learned at the time, and which still applies to this day, is that we cannot rely on historians being fully objective. All historians are human. All historians are biased, and there's no getting around that. We are all flawed creatures. And all of this prompted a historian called Trevelyan to come along and question the idea of whether history was just a science. Yes, history had facts and evidence that could be collected, measured and weighed, but you couldn't do that with the causes and effects of these events. For example, we know World War II happened, but when was the turning point of the war? Despite years of arguing and writing papers, historians cannot agree, and this is definitely still up for debate, which you'll no doubt do in the comment section below because I've asked the question. For some questions, facts cannot deliver us the answers. Also, you can't replicate history and get the same results. You can't just jump back in time and re-watch historical events unfold. We cannot measure or touch history, making it extremely difficult for the scientific method to hold up. Therefore, we can be certain about some pieces of evidence, but cannot be certain about others. Cleopatra wears a dress that's either blue or gold. She's dead, and we don't have the dress. Is the dress blue or gold? How can we science what we cannot see? This has led some people to view history as an art. In fact, I have a BA Honours degree in history, a Bachelor of Arts degree, and the debate on whether history is an art or a science has been a central debate for historians. What Trevelyan and others realised was that history is actually a mixture of the scientific method and interpretation of that research. And it was the literary presentation of both of them put together and written by the historian, a work of history, a history book. Therefore, it was more arty in its approach. And this is true. You will never have all the facts of history. New evidence might be discovered in an attic somewhere that changes all the facts. Or some evidence might be discounted later simply because it's discovered not to be true. There's also a lot of gaps and contradictions that can only be filled with guesses and presumptions. Therefore, you have to interpret the cause and effect of the events after weighing all the evidence that you have available, and then present your findings in a story. And it was realised that a historian didn't only gather evidence, but actually went to observe and collect facts because of his prior beliefs about the past. Not only are all the sources biased, but the very act of studying history is, in itself, unobjective. Therefore, once again, every historian is biased. So the conclusion was that every new generation must rewrite the past in order to clear up the biases of the previous generations. Great. So, not only is there an impossible amount of biased source material to wade through and then put into context, but this process has to be restarted by every new generation, because the interpretation of the past differs depending entirely on who studies it. History never ends. What then is history? Is it an art? If history isn't a science, does that mean that historians are like novelists or poets? And if they are, how do we interpret the past? Unlike science, it's not possible to lay down a precise formula for interpreting sources or a world that you can no longer see or touch. In a lot of ways, it comes down to intuition. What's more likely to have happened? It is reasonable to assume this was probably what happened. But historians are not like poets. The story cannot be just made up, since elements of the story can only come from the evidence itself. But there is an element of art here. While you can fill your books with drawn-out, dreary sentences made up of long technical words that bore your readers to sleep, you could also not do that and add in some humour and make it more personal or entertaining. I know this might come as a shock to many a historian out there, like, oh wow, history doesn't need to be boring. Who would have thought? Anyway, historians in the Leopold von Ranke era were that boring that nobody actually read them. At which point it becomes a question of what's the point of writing history if nobody's going to read it? We're not novelists or comedians, but what we're producing has to be entertaining enough for people to listen. It turns out that people who like to wear tweed are not the right people to teach history. Most history books are hopelessly unreadable. Professional historians publish works that no sane person would attempt to read from beginning to end. Works that are designed explicitly for reference rather than for reading. They usually lack the kind of literary ability that would make their work rival that of minor poets or novelists. If they had it, no doubt most of them would be writing poetry or fiction. The irony being that Evans' own book isn't a particularly easy read either. Anyway, the arty side of history also relates to how we interpret sources. But if we're relying on intuition to interpret these sources, and then write our factual stories from that evidence and interpretation, is this something that we can teach? It's pretty difficult to teach someone how to interpret a source. And in the past, and even now, history teachers don't bother to teach the theories of history. Most would argue that some training is necessary so you can learn the techniques of gathering sources and understand the Rankinian principles of source criticism and citation, and know how to read languages and statistics, etc. But some have argued that having a PhD in history is pointless because while there is training, there are no rules or training for the construction of the story with the evidence. It relies on the artistic muse of the historian creating the history. And if this wasn't bad enough, some historians took it to the next level and no longer saw themselves as historians, but as fiction writers. So the idea was that, yes, you'd take some of the evidence and do some interpretation, but then you'd spend most of your time weaving a clever narrative to bring everything together. If bits of the story were missing, you just make stuff up, like the Greeks did in ancient times. The narrative became more important than the information. The lines of fact and fiction became blurred, and after 1956, things became even more extreme. In 1956, the Hungarian Revolution saw the first rebellion against the Soviet Marxist-Socialist imposed regime. This ignited a crisis of confidence within the socialist movements across the world. The evidence that Marxism wasn't working was staring them in the face, and they lost many of their supporters. From the Soviet Union, Hungary, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Mozambique, and then later the killing fields of Cambodia, Venezuela, China, Poland, Romania, Laos, the Baltic States, Eastern Germany, Albania, Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Sudan, Burma, just to name a few, socialism had failed. Worse, the poor in the capitalist nations were getting richer, not poorer, as Marx had predicted. Clearly, Marx had got everything wrong. From the Manifesto of the Communist Party in 1848 to the revelations of 1956 was over a century of theory and evidence. The crisis of the far left was that the logic and evidence were going against socialism. Put yourselves in the shoes of an intelligent, informed socialist confronted with all this data. How would you react? You have a deep commitment to socialism. You feel that socialism is true. You want it to be true. Upon socialism, you have pinned all your dreams of a peaceful and prosperous future society and all your hopes for solving the ills of our current society. This is a moment of truth for everyone who has experienced the agony of deeply cherished hypothesis run aground on the rocks of reality. So, the Marxist socialists decided that if they couldn't win with evidence, they would reject it. In the postmodernist view, Western civilization has dominated, oppressed, and destroyed the rest of the world in the name of reason, truth, and reality. Therefore, they set out to deconstruct reason, truth, and reality in order to destroy Western civilization. Deconstruction never had meaning or interest, at least in my eyes, than as a radicalization. That is to say, also within the tradition of a certain Marxism and a certain spirit of Marxism. From 1968, the French linguistic theorist Ronald Barthes attacked the idea of history itself. He claimed that historians created a pretend version of the past, with signifiers masquerading as facts. Objectivity was an illusion, since history was being made up by the historian rather than being discovered. All of the quotes, footnotes and bibliographies were simply a ruse to trick the reader into believing that what the reader was reading was reality. The truth, as Barthes put it, was that this history was the historian's own political worldview being imposed into the reader's mind, what Barthes called the reality effect. Derrida then said that a historian's understanding of the past was logocentric, meaning that historians thought words represented reality when they actually didn't. Reality could not be gained from the words on a page. The word dog is arbitrary because it has no meaning. It only gains meaning by its relation to something else. So dog becomes a thing because cat is something different. Derrida then went further than this and said that the meaning of the word changed each time the word was spoken. The reader would interpret the meaning of the word and put their own worldview into the word. Therefore, every word has an infinite amount of meanings and interpretations depending on the reader. This means that every source can be read in an infinite amount of ways. And since you need multiple sources in order to write your histories, there was an infinite amount of interpretations, and none of them could be proven incorrect, since the meaning of the words were personal to each reader. There are no wrong answers. Actual history has no relation to the words on the page, and therefore history is lost to us. This meant that the history that we do have is nothing more than fiction written by the historian who is pushing his own ideological agenda upon the reader, and the very act of questioning this idea is proof that the white male patriarchy is trying to oppose you. The historian is making stuff up as he goes along. He has unlimited power to shape the interpretations of the past and is brainwashing us with his politics and ideals, and we must fight against him. Postmodernists like Keith Jenkins claim that professional history is dominated by the privileged middle class, who then cast out non-believers as heretics. We all therefore must rally against them. The downfall of professional history would then be replaced by the history of oppressed social groups who broke free from the tyranny of the white male capitalist patriarchy. Class, race, gender, nationality, these social groups were what was important. The study of history should end, according to Jenkins. All current rules of history should be abandoned and replaced with Marxist propaganda about the present. All hail Stalin. Or Hitler, since the Holocaust denialist National Socialists also believe this too. In essence, postmodernists believe that science and the scientific method should be rejected. All that matters is the literature itself and its political message. And this is why you get people saying that you cannot trust academic historians, who are all working together in some evil conclave to spout propaganda about how the Holocaust did happen, and how socialism didn't work, or how the earth is round. The impact that postmodernism has had on history and on our society as a whole cannot be understated. Facts don't matter. All that matters is the Marxist cause. And there are numerous examples of this. The media, ignoring facts and spouting fiction on a daily basis. Politicians saying one thing and meaning the complete opposite. Ideologies redefining words to hide their true meaning. How can you trust what you are being told when the very words you speak are a lie? Don't you see that the whole aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it. And this is the point. Postmodernism is a fundamental takedown on Western philosophy and a deliberate attack on history itself, a way of dividing society into panicked social groups in order to usher in a socialist revolution. And I wish I was making this up. I really do. Marxist postmodernism struck such a hard blow to history that the fight goes on decades later. Richard Evans, one of the historians who later took part in the David Irving vs. Penguin Books trial, felt compelled to write his In Defense of History in the 1990s because of the postmodernist attack on history. Note, the Irving vs. Lipstadt trial is a great example of how postmodernism enables the National Socialists to twist the events to suit their racial socialist ideology. They say that Irving was sued by Lipstadt, implying that he was the victim, and that there is some sort of conspiracy to keep the official narrative of what they deem the Holocaust going. The reality, of course, was that Irving sued her when she called him out on his postmodernist distortions. That's why it's Irving versus Penguin Books, not the other way around. Irving sued Penguin Books. But postmodernism has no problems with twisting the truth to suit the political agendas of the far left. But in this case, it came back to haunt them. Not one of Irving's books, speeches or articles, not one paragraph, not one sentence in any of them can be taken on trust as an accurate representation of its historical subject. All of them are completely worthless as history because Irving cannot be trusted anywhere, in any of them, to give a reliable account of what he is talking or writing about. It may seem an absurd semantic dispute to deny the appellation of historian to someone who has written 24 books or more about historical subjects. But if we mean by historian someone who is concerned to discover the truth about the past and to give as accurate a representation of it as possible, then Irving is not a historian. Those in the know, indeed, are accustomed to avoid the term altogether when referring to him, and use some circumlocution such as historical writer instead. Irving is essentially an ideologue who uses history for his own political purposes. He is not primarily concerned with discovering and interpreting what happened in the past. He is concerned merely to give a selective and tendacious account of it in order to further his own ideological ends in the present. The true historian's primary concern, however, is with the past. That is why, in the end, Irving is not a historian. He is a distorian. But if all language can be interpreted in an infinite amount of ways, and there is an infinite amount of interpretations to each and every source, how could Evans come to this conclusion? Simple. Because what postmodernism relied upon is belief in their socialist ideology. And how do you win a debate with belief only? You can't. This is why there are multiple religions in the world. If one was proven correct, the others would surely vanish. But they can't because you can't use belief to prove anything. All you can do is convince others to join you in your beliefs. This is where science comes in. You can believe that you can fly R. Kelly, but science tells you that you can't. In order to prove your belief, you must have evidence to back it up, and that evidence must stand up stronger than the counter-evidence provided. If you distort your evidence to suit your agenda, all you do is undermine your own argument when your opponents find out about your manipulations. Proper historians cannot make things up. For example, King Harold's death at the Battle of Hastings 1066. The Bayeux Tapestry announces that King Harold is dead, but doesn't make clear what's happened. We have a figure with an arrow in the eye, but we also have the same figure being cut down by a horseman with no arrow in the eye. So, to keep things simple here, because I know there's more sources and also disputes about whether the tapestry was altered or not, we basically have three options. King Harold was killed by an arrow in the eye, or he was cut down by a horseman, or he was hit in the eye and then cut down by a horseman. Without further evidence, these three outcomes are correct, and really it would come down to the historian to choose which one they thought was more likely to be correct. So, let's say the first historian chooses the arrow in the eye. The next could come along and say it was more likely that he was cut down by a horseman. Then the third would come along and say he was hit in the eye, then cut down. We now have a healthy historical debate where more evidence can be chucked into it. The interpretation of the text is based upon the text itself. The historians are not making stuff up. If a fourth historian comes along, writes a book which just happens to have no pictures, and says, King Harold was killed by a foot soldier with a dagger. Well, this would go against the Bayeux Tapestry, as well as every other historian in the field, who would simply ask, where's your evidence for that? They wouldn't be able to provide it, or any distorted evidence they did provide would be checked and deemed invalid. So their interpretation is cast out, and this is the power of peer review checking. History isn't written in a bubble, it is a public affair.
Now, it's true what the postmodernists are saying about historians not showing the actual reality of history. In reality, King Harold may have been killed by a foot soldier with a dagger, or abducted by aliens, and those potential realities may make better stories. But since we don't have the sources for them, those realities would be lost to us. We therefore have no choice but to go with the evidence that we do actually have, and that evidence points us in roughly one of three directions. The past is not history. The past and its traces provide the raw material of history. History gives an account of the past in the present.
The best way that I can put this is to say that history is a close approximation of the past. It may not be the absolute reality of the past, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't aim for the absolute reality of the past. We should. It's just that we might never get there.
So, ultimately, we have three core elements of history, and all three must be used. None are more important than the others, none can be ignored. The scientific method is used for gathering and assessing the validity of our evidence, then we have our interpretation of that evidence, and then we must create the historical narrative that we publish at the end. The publication is a combination of the evidence and the interpretation, and weaved together by the historian. History isn't just a science, nor an art, nor just literature. It's all of them. It is a process. Some even call it a craft. The craft of history. But many people forget that the process of history doesn't stop at the publication of a historical work. The publication ends up in the hands of others. Peers, an audience, you. Yes, I'm talking to you now, so pay attention because what I'm about to explain is quite important. Individuals are presented with a publication. And note, this doesn't even have to be a historical work. A news article is just the same, or even this video. Now, the individual judges the publication on its merit. Did the author use the scientific method or not? Do you agree or disagree with the interpretation of the author? And then we have a finding. Ultimately, the individual has four options here. Option 1, they can agree that the scientific method was used, there are no distortions, etc., and they can accept the interpretation of the evidence provided. This will then result in a consensus. Option 2, the individual can agree that the scientific method was used, but disagree with the interpretation of the evidence. This will then result in a debate. The author may actually have strong evidence for what they're saying, but the individual may simply not accept it because they harbour alternative beliefs. Or they may reject it because they cling to an alternative interpretation. This is where the debate comes in. A debate is unique because it can prompt the author or the individual to go back to the beginning to either gather more evidence and reconsider their interpretations, or look at the alternative evidence or interpretations provided by those that disagree. It could also result in one side digging in its heels, thinking they have the advantage in evidence to stand their ground. Usually though, it ends up in a back and forth, with both sides throwing in additional evidence and interpretations. Option 3. The individual can condemn the method of the work as unscientific and disagree with the interpretation. The finding would then be a rejection of the work. It's worth noting that if the author has used the scientific method, you cannot reject their work. You can disagree with their interpretation, and you can invoke a debate or ask them to provide more evidence or clarify their position, but you cannot outright reject it. The only time you can outright reject their method is if you can prove that they were unscientific with their method, which you can only prove with overwhelming evidence. Stating that someone is wrong with little or no evidence, or even distorted evidence, when they have presented an interpretation backed by a lot of evidence, is an unacceptable counter-argument. This is why I would encourage everyone to use as many sources as possible to reduce your chance of your work being rejected. Also, resorting to slander, accusations, insults, and attempting to win with clever tricks are all unacceptable arguments. Option 4. The individual can condemn the method of the work as unscientific, but agree with the interpretation brought by the author. They would then believe in the work. Now, sometimes this is because the author didn't use many sources and just accepted the interpretations of the sources he did use. This would be an accidental victory, but usually what happens is that somebody presents evidence that isn't scientific at all, and the individuals decide to believe in that interpretation anyway because they trust the author or believe in the cause. They may not realise that the evidence is unscientific, or they reject the idea of evidence or science to begin with, instead relying upon emotions. For some individuals, they believe unconditionally and deliberately because they have an agenda. But for others, sometimes they do not see the unscientific nature of the method and actually think they are picking option 1. They have either been tricked, or they accept any evidence that reinforces their prior beliefs. And in the latter case, they are blind to any evidence that contradicts their beliefs. And yes, an ideology is a belief. Overall, options 1 and 2 are acceptable forms of history. Note, a consensus isn't required. All that is required is the scientific method and an interpretation that is reliant on the evidence. If you disagree, then a debate is started, and you go back to the beginning and start again. This, over time, will eventually result in one side proving themselves to have more evidence or more quality evidence and the better interpretation. Any distortions or misinterpretations will be called out and discarded, leaving only the best arguments left. It may still end up being an unwinnable debate, such as what was the main cause of World War I, but that's fine. A healthy debate will lead to more discoveries and reinterpretations and the removal of bad interpretations. This is a necessary process of history, and these debates are the most fun and entertaining parts of crafting, studying, and teaching history. Good history lies in the heart of debate.
Of course, history does not stand still. Tomorrow, new evidence or a new theory could come along and sweep away the conclusions that we made today. If the evidence changes, so must our beliefs. You cannot know anything for certain, but that doesn't mean everything is uncertain. You can only go with the best evidence and argument you can find. But if new evidence or interpretations come along, you must change your perception of the past in order to survive and thrive. The process is never ending. Therefore, the mindset you need to adopt is one of extreme flexibility. As Sun Tzu and many old Eastern philosophers have said, a rock can be chipped away and broken down, whereas water cannot be broken.
Water can flow and it can crash. Be water, my friend.
But how do you, as an individual, figure out if you can trust a publication or not? The simple answer is check to see if it lists its sources. If it's an eyewitness account from the time of the event, a primary source, that's fine. If not, it should have a list of sources. For example, sources for this video will be listed in the pinned comment of the comments section below. If a source isn't a primary source and doesn't list its sources, it's instantly untrustworthy and you should ignore it. If it lists sources, but when you follow them through to the origins, it ends up just quoting from other sources and articles in a nice little feedback loop that doesn't include primary sources, chances are it's untrustworthy and you should ignore it as well. Get into the habit of checking for sources and call them out when they don't list their sources. And, of course, because they don't have sources, primary sources are potentially very difficult to work with, and you shouldn't take them at face value. It's best practice to get a good grasp of the secondary sources first before immersing yourself in the primary sources. Other historians may have already called out the problems for you, making things a lot easier for you. If it's a memoir or something written a long time after the event, just discard it until you have a good understanding of the context and have studied widely on the events, because memories cannot be relied upon and the author would have had time to come up with excuses in order to deflect any criticism of themselves. If the work uses both primary and secondary sources, use it, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be cautious with it. All authors are biased, so keep a skeptical eye. If it's only using primary sources, use it, but be very cautious, because the author isn't aware of the work of other historians who may have figured out and corrected some of the myths and lies within the primary sources themselves.
Wikipedia is okay as an introduction to a topic or a nice place to get pictures, but cannot be trusted because we don't know who wrote it and why. For example, the current Wikipedia page on fascism shows a picture of Mussolini and Hitler and then says they're the two fascist leaders of World War II. I have news for you, Wikipedia. Hitler wasn't a fascist, he was a National Socialist. And there is a pretty significant difference between the two. Such is the power of distorted history written by people who are not accountable for their actions. Just because someone lists their sources doesn't mean they interpreted them correctly, or that new evidence didn't come along after they wrote it. Generally speaking, newer secondary sources are more reliable than older secondary sources because they're standing on the shoulders of giants. They've discovered many more distortions that the previous generations could, and as we get further and further from the events, the personal attachments to the events break away, allowing older beliefs to be cast aside.
Ultimately, you do have to trust someone at some point. We cannot exist on paranoia alone. You have to remain fluid with your interpretation and your perception of history. The facts may change. The interpretations may change. So treat history and everything like you would a rumour. Accept it for now until you get more information and be ready to rethink everything you thought you knew. History is an inquiry. It is the pursuit of knowledge. It is the study of the human mind. And there's nobody better suited to studying that than you.